All right. So we left. Yeah, we're great. We left off with skilled colonial professions. Most of these skilled professions, like in today's society, didn't have like the respect that they do today back then, and I'll explain why. Without a doubt, the most honored profession in the colonial period of skilled professions would have been the clergy or preachers from colony to colony. They wielded a great deal of power. A lot of them were tied to colonial governments. They had a lot of influence. But remember, religions varied, or at least religious denominations varied from place to place. Physicians, believe it or not all that highly respected or esteemed in the colonial period, because what type of college does not exist in America yet and really doesn't exist in Europe yet? There are no medical schools yet. Okay? Do you guys remember learning about the Enlightenment last year? That's what brought forth medical education in Europe, and eventually it makes its way to America, but we'll deal with that later when we get into the early new nation. So, most physicians kind of learned on the fly, and medical practices were really like archaic and out of date. So there's no germ theory yet. Germ theory doesn't come about until after the American Revolution. One very popular method to help patients get better was what was called bleeding. Can I see your arm real quick? All right. So what they would do with bleeding is they would take the arm and they would take a box of razors and they'd put the razors on the arm and smack the top of the box. The razors would go into the arm and they would just bleed out the patient, trying to bleed out bad blood. This is actually one of the reasons why Washington died. Washington had a throat ailment that could have easily been cured, but he just lost so much blood from bleeding. Yeah, I'm not done with the gross stuff yet. I hope your lunch is settled. Plagues were a nightmare because remember, these plagues were typically like isolated to areas. There would be these like epidemics that would break out. Smallpox was kind of like a roller coaster. You'd have like a smallpox outbreak, and then it would go in decline, and then they'd have outbreaks again. But smallpox outbreaks were sort of regional. Same deal with like yellow fever. Yeah.
This is not right. Do you have any more copies of the?
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, no problem.
I just lost one.
So, with that being said, smallpox afflicted 1 out of every 5. That's what you need, right? Yeah. 1 out of every 5 people. So now we're definitely going 35. I'm kidding. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So there you go. So smallpox afflicted 1 in 5 people in colonial America. Early 1700s, there's another smallpox outbreak that occurs in colonial New England, and that smallpox outbreak is going to ultimately lead to a Boston doctor by the name of Samuel Boylston to start the inoculation process. Now, it's interesting because inoculation was not his original idea. He got the idea from Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather got the idea from a West African slave, Onesimus, who said, look, if you go through the inoculation process, you'll probably, and they weren't calling it that yet, you'll actually have less deaths. So, let me explain the inoculation process. You would take the upper arm and you would typically cut 3 to 4 slices into the upper arm. You would take a smallpox-infested scab and you would rub it into the open wound, and now you got smallpox. We just rolled the dice. If you survive, we're good, right? Sorry if you don't make it. But this ultimately leads to immunity. Somebody earlier asked, what about a vaccine? We are a long way away from any type of smallpox vaccine. Boylston becomes one of the most renowned doctors in the colonial period. He's the first American physician to perform a surgical operation. He's the first to successfully remove gallstones, and he will also be the first to successfully remove a cancerous breast tumor. This is really he's very much ahead of his time in the colonial period. Lawyers. As we know, the early colonial colleges were established to educate clergy. Over time, they start to educate in the classics and law. So a lot of the early lawyers in colonial America were not liked, nor were they trusted. So a lot of criminals actually ended up just representing themselves in court. But as these early colleges like Harvard and Yale and William and Mary and Princeton start to develop law programs, the lawyers get better and they are deemed useful and they start to defend high-profile cases and they start to make laws and they're great orators. And they actually, if you look at the majority of the people that were part of the First and Second Continental Congress, most of them had some sort of law training or law degrees. A really great example of this is John Adams. John Adams defended the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre in 1770. He mainly did this because no one else would, but also John Adams is pretty much telling the people of Boston, we want our individual rights as Bostonians, and one of those individual rights is a fair what? Trial. Very good. And if we don't give these guys a fair trial, then it's hypocrisy. So he got a lot of pushback on this, but history has been kind to him on standing up and doing the right thing and providing for this defense. The study of law in America got better in places like Harvard, William and Mary, Princeton, Yale, King's College, which will later become known as Columbia. There's a number of different law programs that kind of pop up in these different little colonial colleges. One of the, if not the most famous law professor in colonial America is George Wythe. How many of you all have heard that name many, many times in your life? Okay, yeah. How many people knew who he was? Probably no one. Okay, so now you can walk away and say, I actually know who George Wythe is. George Wythe was the most highly respected law professor in all of the colonies. He was a professor of law at William and Mary. Just a list of some of the people that he taught. Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, James Monroe, Henry Clay. That's just a short list. Edmund Randolph. The list just kind of goes on and on. It's interesting, though, his death is quite tragic. So Wythe was very much in the belief that African American slaves and free African Americans should have the right to testify in court. That was a slave code had been passed in Virginia and then had become a law in the early new nation that barred African Americans from testifying in Virginia. So he was pushing for this law to be changed. And while he was in the midst of pushing for that law, he was pretty wealthy and he didn't have any children. And his nephew was the heir to his estate. His nephew poisoned him and he died. And the only witnesses were African Americans, and none of them could testify. It's kind of crazy. Wythe is buried at St. John's Church in Richmond, if you ever pop over there for any reason. Okay, so we have Boylston on the left, and we have George Wythe over there on the right. I mean, hey, he was a brilliant guy. All right, so a lot of this is review. We've covered a lot of this material in terms of colonial labor. Agriculture, obviously, both large and small farming is the leading industry in colonial America, about the 1700s. Colonial farmers are growing everything, raising livestock, cash crops, subsistence farming. Virginia, Maryland dominated the tobacco industry. Pennsylvania and New York dominated the grain industry. Like by 1700, both Pennsylvania and New York are producing 100,000 barrels of flour annually. So that's why we often refer to that as the breadbasket. Fishing was a staple industry in the Middle Atlantic and in New England. We talked about those colonies being built on cod and God in New England. Trading was popular everywhere. They traded everything because they don't have a lot of cash flow in the colonies. So everything was used to barter with. And most everything that they made was made by what we would call piecemeal. They made their own clothing. They made their own shoes. They built their own homes. That's why artisans were such a big deal in the colonies. So trading was happening everywhere. Hunting, trading, and small farming in the backcountry, Shenandoah. There's still parts of this state and other rural areas in other states that provide students with excused absences in the first days of hunting season. Did you guys know that? It's pretty interesting because that's a tradition that's been handed down, and some families still are utilizing the ability to hunt to keep themselves and their families fed in parts of the state and others. The triangular trade was the way in which all of the mercantile system worked, right? Natural resources leave America and go to either England or Africa, but predominantly England. Finished products coming out of England, slaves and finished products and trade goods coming out of Africa. And there's no perfect, it's not like a clockwork, situation. These routes are going back and forth across the Atlantic. What this leads to is a mercantile or mercantilism system that the colonies are forced into. They must produce the raw materials and the natural resources and cash crops for the mother country to mass produce. Do you think they want the colonies doing any manufacturing? Yeah, not much. Very little. I mean, really the only manufacturing they're really wanting the colonies to do is manufacturing booze, notably rum and whiskey. There are going to be some other things that we'll talk about that were manufactured. So this is just the triangular trade here. And what we have to realize is it can go here, it can go here, it can go here to here, it can go in all directions. Okay, am I going too quick? Is everybody good? All right, cool. So colonial labor continued, as previously mentioned. Skilled craftspeople and artisans were highly prized in every colony, producing shoes and clothes and houses and barrels and nails and the list goes on and on. Tools, guns. Manufacturing was a small enterprise, and that was by rule of the crown. Mass production of goods would compete against their mass production. Therefore, they wanted to limit it, with the exception of rum production, lumber production, and later a little bit of textile production. So, again, you weren't going to be providing any type of major manufacturing output that would have taken away jobs in England, in the colonies. Britain marked the tallest trees in the colonies for their ships, and this kind of upset the colonists, which is kind of silly. I think this is kind of like an ego pride thing. It's like, oh, we're taking our biggest trees, right? There's plenty of timber to go around. But this is just the anger that the colonists are sort of exuding as a result of the mercantile system. this whole principle of Britain first. But keep in mind that these marked trees were providing for their common defense for a time until they wound up as enemies. So, as previously mentioned, the colonies were forced into the mercantile system. They produced resources, and England, the mother country, produced goods. To help eliminate foreign trade competition, the first parliamentary tax passed, sort of universal tax passed, was called the Molasses Act of 1733. Sounds a whole lot like another act that you've learned about before. The what act? You guys ever heard of the Sugar Act before? Yeah, I remember that. Well, the Molasses Act was actually a precursor to the Sugar Act. Yeah, pretty good. It was a tax on molasses. Mainly, it had less to do with penalizing the colonies and more to do to eliminate what country that is now a competitor in the Caribbean as a sugar producer after they've taken occupation of Haiti. Good guess, but no. Anybody else? France. Nice. Excellent job. It's France. Okay? This was actually more geared to prevent France from unloading their sugar in the colonies. Ironically, there's like two layers of irony here. The first is, how many people have ever heard of the Molasses Act before until today? Probably no one. And the reason you've never heard of it is because it was not enforced. And that's the problem. Even though it was a tax that was levied, everybody pretty much just ignored it. The other layer of irony here is that the Sugar Act will ultimately replace the Molasses Act. And the Sugar Act was less than the Molasses Act, but what made the Sugar Act so unpopular was that it was strictly enforced. So I'm sure if we bumped into somebody on the street right now and are like, what do you know about the Molasses Act? You know, they look at you like you're insane. But this was like the first attempt at that, like to levy a tax across the Atlantic to prevent a competitor from unloading their good in your colonies. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so obviously the Navigation Acts were absolutely hated. And to get around the Navigation Acts, people got into smuggling. And without a doubt, our most famous smuggler in colonial America was none other than John Hancock. Now, like, everybody's heard of John Hancock, right? He's the guy that signed his name real large on the Declaration of Independence. We all know that. But we probably don't think about him as a big-time smuggler. This guy would smuggle anything. He had gotten a fortune from a rich uncle, and he didn't poison him like George West's nephew. The rich uncle left him a fortune, and he just got in the smuggling business. He would smuggle wine, whiskey, tobacco, sugar, clothing. He was really big into smuggling furniture. You name it, he was smuggling it. He made an absolute killing in the smuggling business. He's going to be a big part of the financial backing for the Patriot cause as we head into lesson 5 and 6 toward the revolution. So colonial smuggling was happening in every nook and cranny in colonial America. All right, is everybody good? Yeah. Any questions out there? All right, so colonial religion. As we know, there are many, many different types of religions, at least Protestant, predominantly, religions that are, or at least denominations, that are in the colonies. But there are only 2 established churches that collect taxes, and that is the Anglican, which is the Church of England, and the Congregational, which is Puritan. The Anglican Church, obviously, is dominant in the South, right? Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, even by 1700, Maryland had become predominantly Anglican. And there were still Catholics there, but the Anglican Church was the established church, and also part of New York. Remember, New York was also the safe haven for other groups like Jews and French Huguenots. Anglican sermons were typically shorter, description of hell was less frightening, and amusements were less scorned. Gambling. Okay? How many people have participated in a lottery before? Or how many people out there participated in like a pick'em pool or something like that? Probably done that, right? Yeah, there were Anglican church communities that used these methods to raise money for their church. They would establish lotteries. They would establish like tip boards and things of that nature for people to be able to raise money. Okay. The Anglicans did not have a resident bishop in the colonies. Therefore, non-ordained ministers had a pretty easy job kind of working their way in to lead congregations. This is a huge reason why the College of William and Mary was established in Virginia in 1693 to train these young Anglican ministers, because a lot of the Anglican ministers who had been trained in England, why would they not want to come to America? Any ideas why they might not want to come to America? That could be one reason, a variety of others. Native American attack, disease, starvation, right? I mean, if you've got an Anglican minister in England doing quite well, why would they even getting on the boat and coming across the Atlantic? They're like, I'm good, right? So they start to train their own. Congregationalist church grows in New England, obviously, with exception of Rhode Island. The Congregationalist Puritans educated their clergy at Harvard and Yale. Quakers, they educated their ministers at the University of Pennsylvania. Presbyterians, they educate their ministers at Princeton in New Jersey. But as we move into the early 1700s, there's this fear that the Americans are not devout enough, that they're losing their religion. And I feel like I'm kind of ripping off John Green here, but he has a really great quote. He says, when we get into the First Great Awakening, this is when the American colonists go from being really religious to super religious. And that's what's going to happen here. I pulled this piece of folk art because what we have is a group of Puritans going to church. There's something that's kind of odd that you can see in the image there. What is one of these Puritans carrying with them? A gun. Believe it or not only in Virginia and Massachusetts Bay, but in other colonies, laws were passed early on that required you to attend church with firearms. Why? Very good. In case of a Native American attack. They were worried that they would be caught in a vulnerable situation unarmed. So people were toting guns to church. Kind of crazy. All right. So the Great Awakening. This movement starts in England and in Europe, and it makes its way like a hurricane across the Atlantic to the Americas. A lot of the ministers that are part of the Great Awakening actually do come over in the early 1700s from England to preach and teach and push their religious doctrine in the American colonies. Preachers that are involved in the Great Awakening believe there was less religious fervor and worried that people would not be saved. So this is the birth of the revival. Anybody been to a revival? Oh, just me? Shocker. My grandmother used to take me to revivals when I was a kid. Think I was going to tell her no? Absolutely not. We get that minivan and go. A revival is basically like it's like a festival, right? You've got a ton of people outside And think of the preachers as multiple bands. And they're coming up and they're giving their different, rendition and their different set and their different doctrine to the entire congregation. What this will later lead to is a more even larger evangelical movement that we'll talk about later. So this is the birth of the American revival, all right? One of the important preachers that comes over is this group. It's not just one guy, but it's a group. And they're called the Dutch Reformists. I think I've talked about that before. They were the group that established Rutgers. Did I talk about that in last class? Okay. So they were led by a Dutch reformist named Jacobus Arminius. And they were often called the Arminians. And what the Arminians believed in was what was called the New Light. Okay? The New Light was this doctrine: free will, good works, eternal faith. Does this sound familiar? Because this is the doctrine that most Protestant denominations still follow to this day. All right? And obviously there's a rejection of a lot of this more old light Calvinistic type of doctrine. So as I said before, the Arminian movement, bless you, led to the establishment of Rutgers to educate clergy in New Jersey. A lot of the Dutch reformists kind of like hunkered down in like New York, New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania. Dutch reformists challenged the Orthodox Calvinists, the Old Lights. Challenge accepted. One of those hellfire and brimstone Congregationalists by the name of Jonathan Edwards will take up the pulpit and he will give this hellfire, brimstone, and damnation sermon that is one of the most famous in American history. It is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which I believe I talked a little bit about last class. In that sermon, Edwards will describe a man dangling a spider over a blazing fire, and at any moment he can cast the spider into its death, just as God can cast man into the fires of hell. This is pretty hardcore rhetoric, but I feel like I've got to share it. This is in the sermon. The road to hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. That's hardcore, right? That's the type of rhetoric the old ones are laying down, right? That's pretty intense. But, again, you've got like this dueling going on in this religious movement between the New Lights and the Old Lights. There's Jonathan Edwards. Where are my Hamilton fans? Hamilton fans? I have 1, I have 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. Don't be ashamed. Hamilton's awesome. Fun fact. Guess who Edwards is the grandfather of?
Oh, wait, no.
Aaron Burr, sir. All right, that is Aaron Burr's grandfather. How about that? Yale graduate, Jonathan Edwards. Yeah, we'll talk more about Aaron Burr as we move forward. Aaron Burr was brilliant. He started at Yale when he was like 13 or something. Yeah. That's a hard time streaming it.
Fine. Please.
It's like, I'm going to figure it out. I will figure it out. We'll work it out. Now that would be cool. Okay, that would be cool. Okay, so we should just perform it. Okay. So, this is where we pump the brakes today. Hallelujah. Beautiful. I don't even need it, right? Because I only need a few. All right. George Whitefield, crew. He's the guy, he's like the Beatles, okay? He comes over and it's like this, like, George Whitefield invasion. Everybody's freaking out. I mean, he brought Jonathan Edwards to tears. He is the father of the First Great Awakening. He is the father of the revival. And when I'm saying this, he's like a band. He's on tour. He's popping from town to town, place to place. And the crowds just keep getting bigger and bigger. People are fainting. They're just, they're falling apart because this guy is such an amazing preacher and orator. And then what his shaking sermons ultimately do is inspire imitators. And these imitators become known as itinerants. And they start going out deeper into the backcountry to preach the word of God. And truly, this is where you start to see like the rise of the Methodist and Baptist faiths in America. Now, these were not new. Whitefield and John Wesley have been part of the growth of the Methodist movement. Roger Williams, way back, had started the Baptist movement, but now, like, it's the ball's rolling, and more denominations are being established, and more church communities with these splinter denominations are being, putting down roots in different parts of America. And that's why I said, like, if you go to the Shenandoah Valley and you go to any little town in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, you are not going to have a hard time finding one of 3 or one of 4 churches in every one of those little towns. You're going to find one or more Baptist churches. You're going to find one or more Methodist churches. You're going to find one or more Presbyterian churches. And there's a decent chance you might find one or more Lutheran. Just kind of depends on where you go. The old lights and the new lights, this sort of doctrine and style of preaching carries on. This is a huge moment for American higher education because the new lights are like, we got to establish our own high places of higher education to educate our clergy. So that is how we have Princeton established, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. And they're not the only ones, but they're some of the leading new light institutions that we found. What's the takeaway? This Great Awakening is the first universal religious movement that happens in the colonies. And people start to demand individual rights. They start to demand feelings of nationalism. This is where we start to get an American identity. This is much like a huge piece of the puzzle that takes us into the American Revolution.
It's like a renaissance in the sense that, like,
I would call it a religious renaissance. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. All right, so there he is. Wah, wah, wah. George Whitefield. All right.
Oh my god.
And that, over on the right, that is a revival. Right there, on the right. One of George Whitefield's revivals. All right. Are we good? Okay. Cool.